Hello, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. We're going to analyze in two parts Jack London's To Build a Fire, which hopefully you read with me. This is part one. To Build a Fire was a short story by Jack London that was published in 1902 and then 1908. This is the 1908 version, and it's the one that's recognized as the one that most people read. We always like to look at the first sentence of a story, drama, novel, first page, because that gives us a lot to go on. So if we look at the first sentence, day had broken cold and gray, exceedingly cold and gray, when the man turned aside from the main Yukon trail and climbed the high earth bank where a dim and little traveled trail led eastward through the fat spruce timberland. There's 39 words in that sentence. We immediately suspect that it's a third-person narrator, which means he's outside the story talking to us. And that's, in fact, what this is, third-person narration. So this is the omniscient narrator. We have to believe what he says if the story is going to make any sense. So I want to examine this first sentence carefully now that you've read the story with me, and show you that every word in classic literature counts. These authors, these people who write these stories and novels and dramas do not waste words. It's not like today where you throw a bunch of copy, in your tweets and your texts. This is really basically honed words. They had broken cold and gray. That's a beautiful, right? 5 words, 6 words. Exceedingly cold and gray. So he repeats cold and gray, the narrator, and he repeats it cold and gray, and then he puts an adjective on it. Exceedingly, really exceedingly cold and gray. Not just cold and gray, but exceedingly cold and gray. And that's important to the story because we know, having read it, it's 78 below zero, right? It's very cold. And the man, who's never named in this story, turns away from the main Yukon trail. So he leaves the main trail, which is fatal to him. He's going to die, as we know. So he's giving us, now that we've read the story, you could see this is literature charged with meaning. Right? He climbs the earth bank where a dim and little traveled trail led eastward through the fat spruce timberland. Do you remember what type of tree came crashing down on his fire with the snow? It was a spruce. That's all he sees is spruce trees. These beautiful spruce trees. You can look up what a spruce tree is. You probably have them for Christmas. Anyway, he climbs it up and he pauses for a breath, excusing the act to himself by looking at his watch. So he's making an excuse for leaving the main trail, going on a smaller trail and a steep bank where he pauses for a breath, excusing the act. What act is that? Well, the act of leaving the main trail. He looks at his watch, it's 9 o'clock. We know that he'll get to the fork at 12:30. That's what he believes. He's walking 4 miles an hour, I believe. And so he looks at that, and now he's telling us what the conditions are where he's walking. There's no sun. There's no hint of sun because he's in the north. He's in the Yukon, right? And if you read about the Yukon, there is no sun for half of the time of the year. There's no sun. It's dark. There's plenty of movies that were made about this. I think Al Pacino made one where there's no sun. You got to get acclimated to no sun for half of the year. Very difficult. When it gets cloudy all the time, like if you live in Chicago like I did, and in the fall and winter, it's cloudy all the time, cloudy, no happiness, no sun. So the sun gives life, doesn't it? It gives warmth. But there's no sun here, and that's why it's closed. It's clear. Then he uses the words intangible pall on the face of things, a subtle gloom, right? Subtle gloom, intangible pall. that made the day dark, and that was due to the absence of sun. But he doesn't worry about that because we find out in the next several paragraphs that this guy doesn't have any imagination. The narrator now tells us what this guy wants to do, where he's walking, why he's walking, the hairline trail he could see, etc. He sets the scene. And then on the very next page, they tell us that this man was a newcomer to the land, a Chicago, whatever. And this was his first winter. So he's making a very dangerous move by leaving the main trail. It's his first winter up here. And I don't know if you've ever been in a cold. The coldest I've ever been in is minus 26 degrees. I can tell you, 32 degrees is freezing, right? So 26 below zero is very cold. This guy is, 76 below zero or whatever, 75. It's cold. It's really cold. 76 was cold. My poor car. In the real old days, when it got that cold, we used to keep, electric blankets on the car in the garage or on the street in Chicago to keep the engine warm, the liquids in the engine. That was many years ago. Forget about it. Anyway, so the trouble with him was that he was without imagination. He was quick and alert in the things of life, so he understood what's going on, but not in the significance of things, like 75 below zero. 50 degrees meant 80-odd degrees of frost, because 50 plus 30, right? It impressed him and being uncomfortable, but that it didn't lead him to meditate on the frailty of a creature, right? Of temperature. We are creatures, you and I are creatures of temperature. We have to be, we can't stand it too cold. We can't stand it too hot. We invented air conditioning for when it's too hot and heat when it's too cold. But he doesn't think about that. All he knows is that it's cold. And it never entered his head that there's any more to it than that. And then the narrator tells us that he spat speculatively. So he spits. And there was a sharp, explosive crackle that startled him. He spit again and again. Before it could fall to the snow, the spit crackled. It froze on the way down to the ground. 50 below, the spit crackles on the snow, but this spittle crackled in the air. So then he realizes it's colder than 50 below. So he has experience, and one of the things to think about is what Kierkegaard taught us. Kierkegaard's a philosopher, and knowledge is comparison. You can't know yes from no unless you know one or the other. You can't know left from right. You can't know a spoon from a fork. You have to have a comparison. So obviously this man knows what 50 below is based on where the spit crackles. When it hits the ground, it crackles at 50 below, but it's crackling on the way to the ground. So this is something that he should have noticed and should have taken stock in and said to himself, something is rotten in Denmark here. Something's different. In any case, the narrator goes on, talks about the boys, where he's going to meet them. For lunch, he had some biscuits in his jacket that were against his flesh under his shirt to keep him warm. And he's going to have those for lunch. He makes a deal with himself later. And here we see he plunged among the big spruce trees. The trail was faint. And he goes on walking. And then we're introduced by the narrator to a new character, the dog, the husky. If you've seen huskies, they're beautiful animals. And they're like wolves, especially in Alaska. They're, the brother is the wild wolf, except these are dogs. You can't train a wild wolf like you do a dog. So the animal was depressed by the tremendous cold, 75 below, minus 75. But the narrator tells us that. The dog doesn't know that because the dog did not know anything about thermometers. This is a beautiful way of the third person narrator getting into the dog's head for us. And that's important as this man continues on his journey because the dog will have more sense than the man. Quite honestly, having read the story with me, would you agree with that? That the dog is probably smarter than the man because the man doesn't really think a lot about what's going on with the cold. The animal knows by instinct it's cold. There's several instances where the narrator tells us the animal likes to bury himself in the snow and wait until at least the clouds come over or whatever and block some of the cold, the frigid cold that's coming in there. And he also likes the man because the man builds fire. Men build fire, so he follows men. We find out later, too, that there's really no intimacy between these two people. Between the dog, I should say, and the man, not people. Because the dog is just a slave to the man, right? We're going to talk about that. So the man's chewing tobacco. I don't know why. Because as he's chewing, he can't spit because his mouth won't open. It's closed. The result was a crystal beard of solidity of amber increasing in length on his chin. He can't get the spit out, right? So if it fell down, it would shatter itself like glass, but he didn't mind the appendage. It was plenty all tobacco chewers paid in that country. He had been out before in 2 cold snaps. There's his experience, knowledge is comparison. And he knew that they had been registered at 50 below and at 55 below. So then he continues his walk, and this is a word here, niggerheads. We don't like that word nowadays. They didn't really much know any different there, and they're talking about a type of plant. You can try to look it up. I tried to look it up, and it's not clear what that is. In any case, this is Henderson Creek, 4 miles. The tail, the dog now, he goes back and forth. The dog, the man, the dog. The narrator is just telling us in his own way what's going on as this guy traps through the wilderness, the Yukon wilderness. He can't talk. There was nobody to talk to. Speech would have been impossible because of the ice muzzle on his mouth. So he had nothing to do except eat lunch at the Forks. And he makes 4 miles an hour. He calculates he'll be there, calculated that he'd arrive there at 12:30. 12:30. See it? Okay. All right. Then we're introduced to a new character who never shows up, a guy named Bud, who created something on his cheekbones to prevent them from going numb. So your cheek and your nose are exposed. They're extremities. And if you know anything about cold, the cold hits your extremities first. Your fingers, your nose, anything, your feet, anything that's extreme where it takes the blood a long time to get there, that's the thing that starts getting frozen quickly. So this guy, Bud, apparently devised a nose strap where it covered his cheeks and saved them. And the narrator tells us about the man. What were frosted cheeks? A bit painful. That was all. They were never serious. Well, we find out subsequently that it is serious. Anytime you're going to deal with frostbite, it's serious. Just keep that in mind. If you've always lived in the southern climate, you don't know what the hell we're talking about. But you can use your imagination and think about it. Just open your freezer and imagine living in your freezer, which is probably just at 0, not 73 below 0, 75 below 0. So then he starts walking along the creek, which is totally frozen, but it has these little pockets that never freeze of warm springs. They bubble up. And he knows this from his experience. So he tries to avoid them because if you step in them and you fall in them, you get wet and then you got to dry yourself out, right? So these he calls traps. So he avoids them. There's one scene in here where he feels it cracking. He jumps back. He studies the creek bed, and he reflected a while, rubbing his nose and cheek, and then kept walking. Took a fresh chew. Yeah, okay. So I wrote in the sidebar here, is he stupid? This is something to think about. What is stupid? Well, someone said when I was going to review and analyze this story, Jimmy, you shouldn't use the word stupid. Well, do you know what stupid means? Look it up, and I'll tell you what it means in the next analysis. But stupid, there's nothing wrong. It's a word. And sticks and stones will hurt your bones, but names will never hurt you. I would suggest to you respectfully that this guy is a little stupid. He's been out in 50 below, 55 below. He knows what's going on. This is really cold because of the spit. And yet he keeps walking, and he keeps walking now because he left the main trail. Now, there's a corollary here. Once you begin a gesture, it's fatal not to carry it through. You can read that in the story AMP on this website. And that's one of the corollaries that Jimmy believes is one of the keys to life. Once you begin a gesture, it's fatal not to carry it through. In this case, he begins the gesture of leaving the main trail, and it turns out to be fatal. Okay, so maybe the corollary isn't true, but it is true. And in this case, he shouldn't have began the gesture. The key to understanding once you begin a gesture, fatal not to carry through, is before you begin your gesture, think it through. This guy did not think this through. He didn't do it. He did not think it through. Well, Jimmy, are you saying if you don't think it through, you're stupid? I'm respectfully suggesting that. People who don't think things through when they're doing things, when they just do things, when they don't think them through, are kind of stupid. Because today we have the luck. We're not in the Yukon, ladies and gentlemen, unless you're reading with Jimmy and you are in the Yukon. But you have to use your head when you're doing things and think things through before you start something. So he continues here. He suspects danger, and one time he compelled the dog to go in front, but the dog didn't want to go. This is a great scene here to show you their relationship. And once again, however, he had a close call. And once suspecting danger, he pushes the dog out there, who breaks through, and immediately starts, biting the ice of the immediately frozen ice between its paws, right? He bite out the ice that had formed between the paws of the toes of the paws. And he helps the dog. He removes his mitten and helps tear out the ice particles. He didn't expose his fingers more than a minute, and he was astonished at the swift numbness that smote them. Do you know what astonished is? I'm astonished. Have you ever been astonished? The quickness of how his fingers got frozen, right? Got really cold. That the numbness came in, astonished this guy. Now, that in itself will tell you something's different. Would you agree with that? Something's different in this journey he's on. And then he keeps saying, he says this repeatedly. I think he says this 7 times, I counted. It certainly was cold. You think? When it was 26 below zero in Chicago, where I lived at the time, actually a city outside Chicago, and I was going to work in my car, and I looked at the thermometer, and I took a picture of it, and it said 26 below. I said in my own mind, it certainly was cold, but I was in a car, and I had already a blanket. I had, provisions in case I was stalled someplace, and I couldn't get, the car went dead or whatever, because it happens. You got to be prepared. So I was ready, and not only that, if the car stalled, I'm still in the car, not outside like this guy is. I'm in a car with the windows up. Maybe the car's not running, but at least I'm in shelter, and I can warm myself with a blanket. and I've got water and provisions and a flashlight and maybe some heating elements that I didn't tell you about. So if you're going to face cold weather, you have to be prepared. So at 12:30, he arrives at the fork. He's really happy. He unbuttons his shirt. The action consumed no more than a quarter minute, but he felt the numbness lay hold of his exposed fingers. There it is again. He didn't put the mitten on, but struck his fingers dozen sharp smashes against his leg. But instead, right, he did that, and then he sat down on the log to eat. The sting that followed the striking of his fingers against his leg ceased so quickly, he was startled. He said, "This is unbelievable. I warmed them up by smashing them against my leg, and now they're cold again." He had had no chance to take a bite of the biscuit. Of course he did. He struck his fingers again, right? Returned them to the mitten, for the purpose of eating. He tried to take a mouthful, but the ice muzzle around his mouth prevented. He can't open his mouth. His beard is frozen. He had forgotten to build a fire to thaw out, and he chuckled at his foolishness. This is why I'm suggesting to you, he's stupid. How can you not build a fire when it's so cold, 75 below? He doesn't know it's 75, but his spit freezes on the way down. And he forgets to build a fire in order to eat in comfort. Do you understand? He chuckled and he noticed the numbers creeping into the fingers again, and the stinging, which at first with his toes, he said, was passing away, and he wondered whether the toes were warm and numb, and he doesn't know. He doesn't know. When you're walking, you're pumping your blood, right, throughout your body, but your extremities are not warm. If you've lived in cold weather, you know this. So he was a bit frightened. So now he's starting to get a little afraid. It certainly was cold. There it is again. You see what I'm saying? And he laughed at him at the time. The old man from Sulphur Creek. Here he is. Another character. The old man from Sulphur Creek. Right? There he is. The old man from Sulphur Creek. Let's try to mark that. Harry. This guy plays an important role because he talks to the guy before he dies. The old man told him how cold it gets, and then he laughed at him. He laughed at the old timer at the time. That showed one that could be too sure of things. There was no mistake. It was cold. So he strode up and down, savage, and he proceeded to make a fire. He's got a roaring fire. He eats his biscuits. Takes time, the dog is satisfied near the fire, close enough so he doesn't burn himself. You could get too close. When it's cold, you could get too close without realizing you're too close, and the fire can burn you, right? It could be sparking, whatever. In a campfire, you could do that. He takes a pipe, smokes his pipe, and then he takes the trail to the gun. The man did not know cold. This man did not know cold. The narrator tells us that. The dog was disappointed. He wanted to go. He didn't want to leave the fire, please. This man did not know cold. Possibly all the generations of his ancestry had been ignorant of cold, but the dog knew cold. So the narrator is telling us a little bit about both the dog and the man. So there's a little note on the bottom here I gave you. You can read it if you'd like. 75 it calls hypothermia. The body loses more heat than it can generate. As it progresses, a person's body temperature, this is exactly, by the way, what happens to the man. Jack London didn't provide us with this wonderful definition. He showed us what happens to the man. And ladies and gentlemen, that's one of the difference between classics and just, dime novels. Showing and telling. Showing is much more powerful than telling. You need both. You have to tell the story, but you have to show people what's going on. And that's what makes this classic piece of literature. The narrator is narrating and showing us through his narration what's going on. But this definition, if you read it, if your temperature drops below 95, it causes shivering, which you see he does later on once he can't get warm, right? The automatic defense is shivering. Why does it shiver? To get the blood going. You can't. I don't know if you've ever shivered beyond control. I have. When it's so cold, when it's cold and you can't warm up, you start shivering uncontrollably. You can't control your shivering, which is a scary feeling when you cannot control your shivering, right? Your body tries to warm itself out. You get exhausted, slow movements, slurred speech, confusion, slow breathing. This is exactly what happens to this man, right? So he goes on, he's still walking the dog. This paragraph right here talks about there's no keen intimacy between the dog and the man. Do you know what intimacy is? It's not always like you think, well, he's intimate, he's sexual. That's not what we're talking about. Intimate could be a close relationship. That's what intimate means, a close relationship. And the narrator is telling us there's no sharp intimacy between this dog and this man. The one was a toil slave of the other, and only caresses it had ever received were the caresses of the whiplash and harsh, menacing throat sounds that threatened the whiplash. So if you can use your imagination, and if you've never saw Sergeant Preston of the Yukon, he had a beautiful husky dog too. But in those days, they would use the dogs on sleds and drive them just like horses with a whip. They never whip them, but the whip just goes right across the top, never touches them. It's a flicker. But they would yell at the dogs, onward, right? And they would drag the sleds with the men on top of it, these husky dogs. And there was no intimacy. Sometimes there were. I'm not saying this is a generalization, but I'm just saying sometimes the man treated the dogs, with respect and kindness. The other times with this guy, there's no keen intimacy. So he just whips the dog. So the dog made no effort to communicate its apprehension. Why is the dog apprehensive? Well, he's leaving the fire and it's 75 below. And it's cold. It's cold. He knows this is not a good idea. And if you've ever seen an animal sometimes communicates to you, dogs, right? Their own apprehension. They struggle sometimes. If you're trying to do something and they're pulling back, there's a reason why they're pulling back from something. They sense something. Dogs' senses are not our senses. I've owned a dog only when I was a kid, and then we had to give him up because he ripped the linoleum out. But if you watch and observe animals and dogs, especially, there's a relationship they have, right, with people, with their masters. And they sometimes hint to their masters about situations where they should go. But the dog in this case did not do that. He wasn't concerned in the welfare of the man. Who's saying that? The narrator. It's basically saying the dog doesn't care about the man. It was for its own sake that it yearned back to the fire. Pardon me. That's the narrator. Dog can't tell us that. Dog don't narrate. Maybe in one of the non-classic literatures, the dog might narrate. I don't know. I've never read a dog story. And besides, this is the third person narrator telling us the dog doesn't really care about this guy. Because the guy doesn't care about the dog. That's what intimacy is. But the man whistled, spoke to it with whiplash sounds, so the dog swung in at the man's heels. So he continues the journey. So he didn't seem to be so many springs on the left fork, so he goes there. And then suddenly the accident happens. The man broke through. There we go. See? Halfway to his knees. He breaks through, plunges through his knees, This is the accident. This is the mistake. This is the moment, ladies and gentlemen, when things start going south. Actually, correct that. Things start going south for this guy the minute he left the main trail and went out on his own. Because the old timer from Sulphur Creek told him, in weather like this, do not go alone. Don't go alone. So he breaks through. It would delay him. He's really mad now. He cursed his luck out loud. Right? Why? Because he wanted to be with the boys at 6 o'clock, and they would delay him. This is going to delay him. He's going to gotta build a fire. I gotta build a fire. All right. This was imperative at that low temperature. Of course it is. So he finds trunks of several spruce trees, blah, blah, blah. He starts gathering, the stuff to build a fire with. You need some small things like birch bark, things that'll catch fire easily. He's got some things in his pocket, shredded birch bark that burn better than paper. And you start it with that, and then you can start adding more twigs, larger twigs, larger twigs. If you've ever been a camper, that's what you do. You start small, and then you build big. And you don't need, what do they put on charcoal, right? You don't need that stuff you pour on charcoals to flame up. Besides, he's not carrying anything. So he's got matches, his birch bark, he starts it. He works slowly and carefully, keenly aware, right? He's keenly aware of the danger. He's aware of the danger, right? So he knew there must be no failure. Can't fail. A man must not fail on his first attempt if his feet are wet, and his feet are wet. He's got to dry his feet. He's got to build that fire, take his socks off, dry his shoes, his moccasins, and his socks, because you can't restore it by running. Running, actually, when he's running or walking, he's feeding his extremities, right, with blood to try and keep them warm. But when his feet are frozen, that doesn't work. Just doesn't work. And not when it's 75 below. Does the man know it's 75 below? No. He knows it's colder than 55 below. But he doesn't know the temperature. So this is the narrator reminding us how cold it really is. The man knew this because there's that old timer in Sulphur Creek again saying about the previous fall, now that he was appreciating a device. Already all sensation has gone from his feet. To build the fire, he had been forced to remove his mitten, but the fingers had quickly gone numb. Think about this. Did you feel this when you read the story with Jimmy? I certainly did. His pace of 4 miles kept his heart pumping to the blood, to the surface of his body and extremities, but the instant he stopped, that action of the pump eased down. Remember our definition of hypothermia. This is the narrator showing us hypothermia. The blood of his body recoiled before the cold. What does that mean? Didn't like it. The extremities were the first to feel its absence, the warmth. His wet feet froze faster, and his exposed fingers got number faster, and that was that. But he was safe, he says. He was safe. Toes and nose and cheeks would only be touched by the frost, for the fire was beginning to burn with strength. There he goes. See, everything is good. He's good. He was feeding it with twigs the size of his finger, and in another minute he'd be able to feed the branches the size of his wrist. And then he could get his footgear off, right? He could take his naked feet by the fire. The fire was success. He was safe. And then he remembered the old timer in Sulphur Creek's advice, and he smiled. This is important. The old timer had been very serious in laying down the law, no man must travel alone in the Klondike after 50 below. Well, here he was, and he had an accident, and he was alone, and he had saved himself. And those old timers were rather womanish, some of them, he thought. All a man had to do was keep his head, and he would be all right. Is that true? Now, I know some of you, as you know, especially the ladies, are going to say, "What do you mean, womanish? What is that? That's sexist." Don't forget, it's 1908, a little different, right? Right? There's some women who, can really, women are a lot smarter than men in many ways. I'm just telling you. Okay, I'm just telling you. So don't let this bother you, right? The narrator's telling us this because that's the sign of the times. Enjoy it. Live within the story. Don't impose your own values, for heaven's sakes. But it was surprising the rapidity with which his cheeks and nose were freezing. Lifeless they were, for he could scarcely make them move together to grip a twig. So he's having trouble grabbing things because his fingers are freezing, right? Part one is done, the analysis. We're going to stop there. If you read the story, you already know what's going to happen to this guy, but we're going to stop there. I want to thank you for visiting. Learn more by watching part two of this analysis of Jack London's To Build a Fire. And be sure to visit and read the other classics on our website. If you have an email, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com is my email. Please let me hear from you. And thank you again for coming by. Stay warm.